It's Random Thoughts again, and today we are going to talk about Zanzibar. And this is a reaction to something that is trending right now, and that is this idea that Zanzibar and Britain did go into a war that turned out to be the shortest war ever. And that war ended in less than 45 minutes after it started. But when you read history carefully, that wasn't actually a war. It was far from being a war. It only seems to be a war when the event itself is stripped of all the historical context that begins almost 100 years before in Muscat, Oman. Within the right context, what happens on the 27th August 1896 was not a war, but a rebellion by people who had been subjugated since the founding of Zanzibar in 1856 as a sultanate. It is important to understand that Zanzibar was an offshoot of Oman, which was a sultanate, or which is a sultanate to date, that is located to the southeast of the Arabian Peninsula. The Sultanate of Oman and Muscat, which is how it's usually referred to, has been around from around 17th century, but has existed longer than that in different forms. In the late 18th century, the Sultanate of Oman basically became a colony of the British. In 1800, several treaties were signed, and basically all these treaties gave the British all the powers to control the affairs of the Sultanate. Now, nothing will happen without the approval of the British. And in particular, the treaty stipulated that Britain was going to appoint a representative who will stay in Oman. And this representative basically became the head of government, or the head of the state, we can even say, because all decisions of the Sultan had to be approved by this representative of the British Empire. And the influence of Britain continued to grow after that. And we can say that as time went by, Oman became basically a very subjugated colony of the British. And of course, that meant that all critical decisions that had anything to do with the affairs of the state had to be approved by the British through this representative. Even the decision of Said bin Sultan in 1840 to move the capital of Oman and Muscat to Zanzibar was a decision that had to be approved by the British. And every time there was a vacancy at the High Office, that means the office of the Sultan and any other high office within the Sultanate, the British had to approve who filled it. And in fact, even before the Zanzibar issue of 1896, the British had in several times overruled somebody being appointed or somebody trying to assume the office of the ruler of the Sultanate. However, it had never reached a point where they had to use force. For example, in 1868, Hassan bin Qais was elected Imam of Oman. Now, the British did not like Hassan bin Qais. For some reason, they thought that he was somebody who was not going to do things the way the British wanted. And they refused to approve his appointment even after being elected. And he was deposed several years later in 1871 by his cousin Said Tak. In fact, even the splitting of the Omani Empire into two, that is Oman and Zanzibar, was the work of the British. Many people don't know about this. In 1856, Sultan Said bin Sultan died. And of course, the next thing was to be who was going to be the next ruler. And seems like two of his sons were both liked by the British. And it could not be decided who was going to become the next sultan, even though there was basically a law. We can say that the first son was supposed to become the next sultan, but seems like the British were playing some game here, and it seems like they encouraged even the younger son to aspire to be the sultan. And because of that, there was this conflict at the palace, and the British stepped in and they decided to resolve that problem by having the empire split into two. That means having Oman as a different sultanate and then creating Zanzibar to be another one. At this time, of course, the empire has its headquarters in Zanzibar. With this resolution, the elder son, Said Thuwaini bin Said al-Busaidi, becomes the next sultan of Muscat and Oman. And then the younger brother, Said Majid bin Said al-Busaidi, became the first sultan of Zanzibar. Now, even after the split, of course, the British continued to control the two states, and they managed all the critical affairs of both Oman and Zanzibar. They decided who did what and what happened and how these two interacted with the rest of the world. And of course, they continued to influence who became the next sultan whenever there was a vacancy in the palace, both in Oman and also in Zanzibar. Now, this is where we have the issue of 1896 happening in Zanzibar, or this is what caused it. On August 25th, 1896, Sultan Hamid bin Tuwaini of Zanzibar dies. And after his death, the royal house for the first time decides to have somebody succeed him without actually consulting the British. And this, of course, angered the British. The royal house had decided that the person who was going to be the next sultan was Sultan Khalid bin Bargash. Now, the British preferred somebody else. They preferred a guy who went by the name Hamoud bin Mohammed. And when the British realized that Sultan Khalid bin Bargash had basically been given the throne, they, of course, gave an ultimatum to the palace that that guy should vacate and have Hamoud bin Mohammed become the next sultan. But the royal house basically had decided, no, we are going to have Sultan Khalid bin Bargash as the next sultan. And that ultimatum that the British gave the royal house, of course, was ignored. And after it was ignored, the British decided to go in and force their way and have their will respected. And it can't be called a war because Sultan Khalid bin Bargash didn't really organize any military. It's basically the guards at the palace who stood there to kind of like protect him, and some civilians who came along, his supporters, and they stood at the palace. And the British come and they attack and blow up the place and kill like 500 citizens basically. And it ended, of course, because the Zanzibaris were not preparing for any war. They were just trying to say, hey, we prefer this guy and not the guy you people want. And Sultan Khalid bin Bargash ran and escaped to the embassy of the Germans in Zanzibar, and he stayed there, and the Germans refused to give him up to the British, and they evacuated him to the mainland Tanzania, then Tanganyika, and he stayed there for a while. And of course, the First World War happens and the Germans lose the war, and the Germans lose Tanganyika as well. And after that, Sultan Khalid bin Bargash is arrested by the British, and he did stay in detention for a while. So what happened on the 27th August 1896 was not a war, but it was just subjugated people who had sought to break free, but were not successful. They were just trying to say, hey, we don't like how you people are managing us, but they were not successful. So it wasn't a war, really. It was some form, we can't even call it a rebellion. It was a protest, basically. Those are my random thoughts.